Hello, greetings, and welcome back to my very own YouTube channel to all of my YouTube viewers. My name is Mr. Jonathan Rivington, and today I will be sharing with you the biblical story of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over all the land. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In Matthew's gospel, he basically cries out in Hebrew or in Aramaic, and he actually uses the Hebrew and Aramaic expression because he is a Jew after all. When Jesus had cried out once again with a very loud voice, he gave up his spirit. According to the Gospel of Luke, the veil of the temple rips from the top to the bottom. And immediately after the veil has been torn from the temple, Jesus immediately cries out and says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." So according to the Gospel of Luke, all of the women who had followed Jesus all the way from Galilee to Jerusalem, they begin following Joseph of Arimathea and witnessing how he places Jesus' body into the tomb to lay his body down and to give him a proper burial. The women immediately return to their houses to prepare spices and other sweet oils and other sweet perfumes to anoint Jesus' body according to the proper Jewish customs for proper burial. And then the next day they go to the tomb according to Luke's gospel, and they witness that the tomb, or that the stone, is rolled away from the entrance of the tomb. They know that something has happened to Jesus' body. They know that something has happened to Jesus, but they don't know what has happened to him because they're in suspense. So two angels, according to Luke's gospel, appear to these women, and they ask the women, saying, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? Jesus is not here. He has risen." And it's not until this point that they begin remembering what Jesus had said to them and spoken to them, immediately begin coming back to their memory. And immediately after this, Mary Magdalene, and explaining these things to all of Jesus' 12 disciples. The only difference is that, the men or all of Jesus' 12 disciples immediately think, "No, the Lord cannot possibly had risen from the dead here." Peter and the rest of them are thinking, "All right, you women are out of your minds here. He couldn't have possibly had risen from the dead. He's dead. He's gone." All of the women begin refreshing the disciples' memories, and they begin saying, "No, this is what was really told to us, not only from Jesus' own mouth, but also from the mouths and the lips of the angels." But according to Luke's gospel, regardless of how many times the women address this issue, they choose not to accept the women's testimony. So Peter gets up and runs to the tomb himself to look for himself. Because he wants to be sure that Jesus has risen from the dead. So he runs. And when Peter arrives at the tomb, all Peter sees is remaining evidence in the tomb of Jesus are the linen cloths or the linen sheets that Jesus had been wrapped in. He begins walking out of the tomb and he begins walking away. He begins to recount in his own mind that Jesus has risen from the dead, even though he doesn't fully come to the realization until Jesus physically appears to him, according to the Gospel of Luke. And they begin saying, well, if the Lord possibly could have risen could have risen from the dead, how is it possible that the Lord could have gone to the village of Emmaus? Because according to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus, after he had risen from the dead, is on the road to Emmaus with two other disciples of his, begin talking among themselves about the very painful and gruesome events which had happened to Jesus. And Jesus, in an instant, begins to walk with them and talk with them on the road to Emmaus. And he himself begins saying, what are these things which you are discussing while you are still upset and severely sad? And one of Jesus' disciples, whose name was Cleopas, answers him and says, are you not only a stranger in this city of Jerusalem? And do you not realize what has just taken place in the city? And Cleopas continues and he says, these things concerning the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, how our Jewish leaders and our religious leaders had condemned him to death, since he was also a prophet, mighty in word and also in mighty deeds before God and all the people of Israel. And Jesus answers them and he says, "O you foolish men, to believe all that the prophets had spoken. Wasn't it written according to the scriptures that the Messiah would suffer all of these things and then enter into his glory?" Because what he's doing is he's reassuring them. And he is saying, "Oh, you foolish and you slow-hearted men, to believe everything that the prophets had written down. Wasn't it, had it not been written according to the scriptures that the Christ and the Messiah himself would have to suffer everything that had been written about him? Was it not necessary that the Messiah and the Christ should die and have to suffer death by crucifixion and then enter into his glory?" You see, because now Jesus is reassuring them that he has returned, that he is back from the dead. And what he is also doing is he is opening their minds and letting them understand, this is what had been written about me. See, this is what Jesus is telling them. These things were written about me myself. This is what I was supposed to do. This is what I was supposed to go through. I was supposed to be crucified, and it has already taken place. I have already been crucified. It was written that I am supposed to be risen from the dead, and now I'm here. Now I'm back. So now, after Jesus has been on the road with them to Emmaus for quite some time, he has been traveling with with these two men, with these two disciples of his. Jesus begins to act as if he wants to go a little bit further on. But one of them, I don't know if it's Cleopas or the other, or Cleopas's companion, but one of them immediately stops Jesus from going further, and he says, "Why don't you spend the rest of the evening with us? Because since the day is almost over, and the day is almost finished," meaning the day has been pretty much well spent. And Jesus agrees to go and spend the night with them. Jesus immediately sits down and breaks bread with the two of them at the table, and Jesus immediately begins taking the bread himself, and he begins blessing the bread. And this is when Cleopas and this other disciple of Jesus, who is Cleopas's companion, immediately begin recognizing that Jesus is risen from the dead, that he has risen from the dead. You see, this is when they begin realizing, this has really happened. He really is back. What is going on is they're recounting. Now they're taking into account everything that Jesus has just spoken concerning his death by crucifixion and concerning his very own resurrection. They're beginning to take this into their memory. They immediately get up and go back to Jerusalem, and they begin telling them, the Lord is risen indeed, and the Lord has also appeared to Simon, meaning the Lord has also appeared to Peter. This is when they begin discussing the event that has just taken place on the road to Emmaus between Cleopas and his companion and Jesus' physical appearance after his death. So the disciples begin saying to themselves, well, how can it be possible? How can the Lord possibly have been on the road to Emmaus? In Luke's gospel, Jesus appears to not only Mary Magdalene, but also to the rest of his disciples and followers. And all of his disciples are severely afraid of him because they are thinking that Jesus is a ghost. Because they don't know that it's really him. Jesus immediately stands in front of them. Now this is when Jesus physically appears to all of them, and he says to them, peace be with you. And this is when, this is immediately when all of his disciples, including the women, are severely terrified and frightened. This is when Mary Magdalene and the rest of Jesus' disciples and apostles begin thinking, wait, this isn't possible. The Lord cannot physically appear to us. Also in Luke's gospel, Jesus' exact words are, why are you severely frightened? And why are these doubts, why are you having these doubts arising in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. Then you will know that it is really me. Jesus begins recounting all of the scriptures that had been written according to the prophets about him. And he says to them, these are all the things that were written in the scriptures and in the law of Moses concerning everything that was supposed to happen to me, that I myself will be crucified, and that I myself would rise again from the dead after 3 days. Now you are to be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Samaria and to the whole entire world. And he says to them, and remember that I will physically send the promise of my Father upon you all. But you must all remain here in the city of Jerusalem until I myself have sent the power of the Holy Spirit itself upon all of you. And immediately after this, Jesus leads all of his disciples out to the village of Bethany, and he immediately begins lifting up his hands and blessing all of them. And after this, after Jesus has blessed all of them, and after Jesus has physically commissioned all of his disciples, Jesus is immediately lifted up and taken up into heaven.